The auctioneer's gavel struck wood with such finality that Sarah felt it crack through her ribs like a bullet. And beside her, her younger sister Sophie let out a small whimper that only Sarah could hear over the roar of male voices bidding on their futures. The September sun beat down mercilessly on the makeshift platform in Sloan, Nevada, where the two sisters stood with their hands bound loosely in front of them. Their father's debts, having sealed their fates just 3 days after his death from consumption. Sarah was 21, her dark auburn hair pulled back in a simple braid that hung down past her shoulders, and Sophie was 19, blonde and delicate in a way that made Sarah's protective instincts flare even now, when there was nothing she could do to save either of them from this humiliation. "Sold to Mr. Gideon Marsh for $400, the auctioneer bellowed, and Sarah felt strong hands grip her arms to pull her off the platform. She twisted back to look at Sophie, whose wide blue eyes were filling with tears. "Wait," Sarah cried out. "Please, my sister." But another bidder was already calling out numbers for Sophie, and Sarah was being dragged through the crowd of dusty cowboys and miners who had gathered in the center of town for what passed as entertainment in these parts. Her heart hammered against her chest as she heard the bidding continue behind her, heard Sophie's name being called out like she was livestock, and Sarah struggled against the man hauling her toward a wagon. "Easy there," Gideon Marsh said, his voice rough as gravel. He was a thick-set man in his 50s with a gray beard and small, calculating eyes that looked Sarah up and down in a way that made her skin crawl. "You fight me, girl, and I'll make sure you regret it every day of your miserable life." Sarah forced herself to still, though every muscle in her body screamed to run. She could not leave Sophie. They had never been apart, not in all their lives. Their mother had died giving birth to Sophie, and Sarah had helped raise her, had protected her through their father's declining years and increasing desperation. Now, they were being split apart like calves from their mother, and Sarah felt something inside her breaking. Behind them, she heard the gavel strike again. "Sold to Mr. Vernon Pike for $350, Sophie screamed, and the sound cut through Sarah like a blade. "Sophie!" Sarah shrieked, trying to turn, but Marsh's grip was iron. Then a new voice cut through the chaos, deep and steady and somehow commanding despite not being raised. "Hold on now." Everyone turned. A tall man was pushing through the crowd, his dark hat pulled low over his face, but Sarah could see the strong line of his jaw and the determined set of his shoulders. He wore simple clothes, a worn blue shirt and leather vest, dusty chaps over dark pants, and his boots had seen better days, but there was something about the way he moved that made people step aside. He reached the platform where Sophie stood trembling, tears streaming down her face, and he looked up at the auctioneer. "I want to buy that girl." Vernon Pike, a squat man with a red face and breath that reeked of whiskey even from 10 feet away, turned with a snarl. "Too late, cowboy. She's mine." "I paid fair and square." The stranger tilted his head slightly, and something in the gesture made Pike take a step back despite himself. "I will give you $500 for her, right now. Cash," the crowd murmured. That was a fortune for a girl sold to settle debts, more than anyone had expected to pay today. Pike's eyes narrowed with greed, but then he shook his head. "I don't care if you offer 1,000. I bought her and I am keeping her. I got plans for this little dove." Sarah saw the stranger's hands flex at his sides, saw the way his whole body tensed, and she realized he was wearing a gun at his hip, the holster tied down like he knew how to use it. But instead of drawing, he turned to the auctioneer. "The bill of sale has not been signed yet," the stranger said, his voice still calm but with an edge like steel underneath. "Legally, she is not his until the paperwork is complete. I am offering more money. By rights, the higher bid should take precedence. The auctioneer shifted uncomfortably, clearly not wanting trouble but also not wanting to lose the extra money. He looked between Pike and the stranger. "Now see here," Pike began, his face going even redder. $700, the stranger said, and now he was looking directly at Pike. "For the girl, final offer. Take it and walk away happy, or refuse and walk away with nothing but your original bid refunded." "You cannot do that," Pike sputtered, but he was looking at the auctioneer desperately. The auctioneer cleared his throat. "Actually, Mr. Pike, the gentleman is correct. Until the papers are signed and filed with the county clerk, the transaction is not final. And given that he is offering substantially more, I believe it would be in everyone's best interest to accept the higher bid." What the auctioneer really meant, Sarah realized, was that he got a percentage of the sale, and $700 was a lot more lucrative than $350. Pike looked like he wanted to argue further, but something in the stranger's steady gaze made him reconsider. Finally, he spat in the dirt and threw up his hands. "Fine, take the little mouse, but you are a fool for paying that much." The stranger did not respond. He was already reaching into his vest and pulling out a leather pouch. Sarah watched in amazement as he counted out the money, real gold and silver coins that glinted in the afternoon sun. Who carried that kind of money around? And who would spend it on a girl he had never met? With Sophie's sale renegotiated, the stranger turned his attention to where Marsh was still holding Sarah's arm. He walked over slowly, his boots crunching in the dusty street, and stopped a few feet away. "I would like to buy that one too," he said simply. Marsh's grip tightened. "Not for sale." "Everything is for sale at an auction," the stranger replied. "That is the point. I will give you $600. "I paid $400 for her," Marsh said, his voice suspicious. "Why would you pay more?" The stranger glanced at Sarah, and for just a moment their eyes met. His were gray, she realized, like storm clouds, and there was something in them she could not quite read. Anger, maybe, or disgust at the whole proceeding. "Because they are sisters," he said, looking back at Marsh. "And it seems cruel to separate them. 600. Yes or no?" Marsh considered this, his small eyes darting between the money pouch in the stranger's hand and Sarah's face. She could practically see him calculating, trying to figure out if he could get more. 800, Marsh countered. 650, the stranger said. "And that is only because I am in a generous mood. Refuse and I walk away, and you are stuck with a girl who will fight you every step of the way." He looked at Sarah again. "She looks like a fighter." Sarah lifted her chin, meeting his gaze squarely. She was a fighter. She would make Marsh's life hell if she had to go with him. Marsh must have seen the same determination because he let out a long breath through his nose and finally nodded. "Fine. 650. But I want it now before you change your mind." Within minutes, the transaction was complete. The stranger paid both the auctioneer and Marsh, signed the necessary papers, and suddenly Sarah and Sophie belonged to him instead. The crowd began to disperse, disappointed that there had not been more drama, and Sarah found herself standing next to Sophie, both of them staring at the tall cowboy who had just spent nearly $1,400 on them. He turned to face them fully for the first time, and Sarah got a better look at him. He was younger than she had initially thought, probably only in his late 20s, with a strong, weathered face that spoke of years working outdoors. His dark brown hair curled slightly where it touched his collar, and there was a scar above his left eyebrow that looked like it had come from a hard fall or a harder fight. But it was his eyes that caught her attention, those gray eyes that looked at her and Sophie with something almost like concern. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his voice gentler now. Sophie shook her head mutely, still crying softly. Sarah squared her shoulders. "What do you want with us?" she demanded, trying to keep her voice steady. "What are your plans?" He studied her for a long moment, then reached up and took off his hat, revealing more of his face. "My name is Xander Orville. I have a ranch about 2 days north of here, up in the foothills. I need help running it, and you two need a place to go. It seems like we can help each other." "And what do you expect in return?" Sarah asked bluntly. "You did not spend that much money out of the goodness of your heart." Something flickered in Xander's expression, something that might have been pain. "I expect honest work. Cooking, cleaning, tending the animals, mending clothes. The same things anyone would do to earn their keep. Nothing more." "Nothing more," Sarah repeated, not believing him. Xander's jaw tightened. "I am not Vernon Pike or Gideon Marsh. I am not looking for a wife I have to buy, and I am not looking for something else either. What I saw here today made me sick, but I could not stop the whole auction. I could only do what I could do. So I bought you both, and now I am offering you a chance at a decent life. Take it or leave it, but make up your mind quickly because I want to get out of this town before sundown." Sarah looked at Sophie, who was staring at Xander with a mixture of hope and fear. The truth was, they had no choice. If Xander decided to leave without them, they would still legally belong to him, and they would be stranded in Sloan with nothing and no one. At least if they went with him, they would be together. "We will come," Sarah said finally. "But if you break your word, if you try anything, I will find a way to make you regret it." A small smile tugged at the corner of Xander's mouth. "Fair enough. Now come on. My wagon is at the edge of town, and we have a long journey ahead." He turned and started walking, and after a moment's hesitation, Sarah and Sophie followed. The sisters held hands as they walked through the dusty streets of Sloan, past the saloons and the general store and the small church that stood at the far end of town. People watched them go, some with curiosity, others with the blank indifference of those who had seen too much hardship to care about anyone else's troubles. Xander's wagon was simple but sturdy, pulled by 2 strong horses that looked well cared for. There were supplies in the back, sacks of flour and sugar, crates of canned goods, coils of rope and tools. He had clearly come to town for more than just an auction. "You two can sit in the back," Xander said, gesturing to the wagon bed. "There are blankets if you get cold. We will make camp tonight about 15 miles up the road, then continue tomorrow." Sarah helped Sophie climb into the wagon, then pulled herself up. The wood was rough under her hands, and she could feel every jolt as Xander climbed into the driver's seat and took up the reins. With a click of his tongue, the horses started forward, and Sloan began to fall away behind them. For a long time, no one spoke. The only sounds were the creak of the wagon wheels, the plodding of the horses' hooves, and the occasional call of a bird overhead. Sarah held Sophie close, feeling her sister's shoulders shake with silent sobs, and she stroked her hair the way she had when Sophie was small and had nightmares. "It is going to be all right," Sarah whispered, though she was not sure she believed it herself. "What if he is lying?" Sophie whispered back, "What if he is worse than the others?" "Then we will figure something out," Sarah said firmly. "We have each other, that is what matters." But as the miles passed and the sun began to sink toward the horizon, Sarah found herself watching Xander's broad back, wondering who this man really was, and why he had done what he did. Men did not spend that kind of money without expecting something in return. It was a rule as old as time, especially in the harsh realities of the Nevada desert in 1882. Yet he had not looked at them with lust or cruelty, had not touched them except to help Sophie into the wagon, and had kept his distance since they left town. When the sun was low enough to turn the desert landscape into shades of gold and crimson, Xander pulled the wagon off the main road and into a sheltered area near a stand of Joshua trees. He climbed down and began to unhitch the horses, moving with the easy efficiency of someone who had done this 1,000 times. "You can stretch your legs if you want," he called over his shoulder, "but stay close. There are rattlesnakes out here this time of evening." Sarah helped Sophie down from the wagon, and they both stood awkwardly, unsure what to do. They watched as Xander led the horses to a small water trough he had filled from a canteen, then began to set up camp. He moved methodically, gathering wood for a fire, laying out bedrolls, pulling out supplies to make dinner. Finally, Sarah could not stand it anymore. "We can help," she said, "if you show us what you need." Xander looked up from where he was building the fire. "You know how to cook over an open flame?" "Our father was a prospector," Sarah said. "Before he got sick, we traveled with him. We know how to manage on the trail." Something in Xander's expression softened. "All right. There is salt pork in that crate there and beans. Coffee too, if you can get the pot boiling. I will finish setting up the camp." Working gave Sarah something to focus on besides her fear and anger. She and Sophie moved around each other with practiced ease, Sarah cutting the salt pork while Sophie measured out the beans and water. Soon the smell of cooking food filled the air, mixing with the smoke from the fire. When everything was ready, Xander came and sat across the fire from them. He served himself a portion, then waited until both Sarah and Sophie had filled their plates before he started eating. They ate in silence, the crackling of the fire the only sound. Finally, Sophie spoke up, her voice small. "Thank you for buying me away from that man." Xander looked at her, his expression unreadable in the firelight. "You should not have been in that position in the first place." "Our father owed money," Sarah said, feeling the need to explain. "To the company store, to the doctor, to everyone. When he died, the creditors came. We had nothing left. The sheriff said the only way to settle the debts was to sell us at auction. We tried to refuse, but they said it was legal, that we were our father's property and now we were assets that could be liquidated." She spat the last word like it was poison. "It is legal," Xander said quietly, "but that does not make it right. So you bought us out of the goodness of your heart." Sarah challenged. "Forgive me if I find that hard to believe. You are a stranger. Why would you care?" Xander set down his plate and looked at her directly. The firelight cast shadows across his face, making him look older and more tired than he probably was. "My sister was sold the same way," he said finally. 5 years ago, down in Arizona. My parents died in a Comanche raid when I was 15 and she was 12. We tried to make it on our own, but we were just kids. She got sick, and I could not afford a doctor. I went to town to try to find work, and when I came back, she was gone. The neighbors told me she had been sold to cover the medical bills the doctor had racked up trying to save her life." He paused, his jaw working. "I tried to find her, spent 3 years searching, never did. I do not even know if she is alive." The silence that followed was heavy. Sarah felt something shift inside her, a tiny crack in the wall she had built around herself. "I am sorry," she said softly. Xander shook his head. "It is not your fault. But when I heard about the auction in Sloan, heard that they were selling 2 sisters, I could not walk away. I could not save my sister, but maybe I could save you too." He looked at both of them. "I meant what I said. I need help at the ranch and I will pay you fair wages. Once you have earned enough, you can leave if you want. Go anywhere, start over, I will not stop you." "You would let us go?" Sophie asked, her eyes wide. "You are not slaves," Xander said firmly. "I do not care what the papers say, you are people and you deserve to be treated like people. All I ask is that you work hard and do not steal from me. Anything beyond that, we can figure out as we go." Sarah studied him, trying to see past the words to the truth beneath. She had learned the hard way not to trust easily, that people often said one thing and meant another. But there was something in Xander's face, in the way he spoke about his sister, that made her want to believe him. "All right," she said finally. "We will work for you, but I am holding you to your word." "I would not expect anything less," Xander said, and this time his smile was real, reaching his eyes and making him look younger. "Now finish eating and get some rest. We have another long day tomorrow." That night, Sarah and Sophie slept in the wagon bed while Xander took first watch by the fire. Sarah lay awake for a long time, listening to Sophie's breathing even out beside her and watching the stars wheel overhead. She thought about her father, about the slow decline that had ended with him coughing blood into a rag and begging her forgiveness for leaving them with nothing. She thought about standing on that platform in Sloan, feeling like an animal being sold to the highest bidder. And she thought about Xander Orville, the cowboy who had spent a small fortune to save them from fates they could not bear to imagine. Tomorrow, she promised herself, she would start earning her keep. She would prove that she and Sophie were worth the risk he had taken. And maybe, just maybe, she would let herself hope that things could get better. The next day dawned clear and hot. Xander woke them before sunrise, and they broke camp quickly, eating a simple breakfast of hardtack and coffee before getting back on the road. As they traveled north, the landscape began to change. The flat desert gave way to rolling hills, and the Joshua trees were replaced by scrub brush and the occasional juniper. In the distance, Sarah could see mountains, their peaks still holding snow even in September. "Is your ranch in the mountains?" she asked Xander, the first words she had spoken to him all morning. "In the foothills," he corrected. "There is a valley with good grazing and a creek that runs year-round. My father homesteaded it before he died. I have been building it up since I was old enough to do the work myself." "By yourself?" Sophie asked. "That must be lonely," Xander shrugged. "I have had hands come through from time to time, drifters looking for work mostly, but no one has stayed long. It is isolated and the work is hard." "We are not afraid of hard work," Sarah said, a little defensively. Xander glanced back at her and she saw a hint of approval in his eyes. "I believe you." As the morning wore on, Sarah found herself relaxing slightly. Xander was not chatty, but when he did speak, his words were measured and thoughtful. He pointed out landmarks, warned them about dangerous animals they might encounter, and asked polite questions about their lives before the auction. He never pried, never pushed, and when Sarah did not want to answer something, he let it drop without complaint. By midday, they reached a small creek, and Xander stopped to let the horses drink and rest. He helped Sarah and Sophie down from the wagon, and they all stretched their cramped muscles. "How much farther?" Sarah asked. "We will get there by evening if we keep a steady pace," Xander said. "The last few miles are uphill, so it will be slower." Sophie wandered to the edge of the creek and knelt down, splashing water on her face. Sarah watched her sister, noting the dark circles under her eyes and the way her shoulders slumped. Sophie had always been the sensitive one, the dreamer who told stories and sang songs while Sarah did the practical work. This whole ordeal had hit her harder than Sarah wanted to admit. "She will be all right," Xander said quietly, coming to stand beside Sarah. "Give her time." Sarah looked at him sharply. "You seem very sure of that." "I have seen people recover from worse," Xander said. "She is young and she has you. That is more than a lot of people have." "What about you?" Sarah asked before she could stop herself. "Do you have anyone?" Xander's expression closed off slightly. "I have the ranch. That is enough." But Sarah heard the loneliness in his voice, the same loneliness she had felt these past few years as their father's health failed and their world grew smaller. She wondered what it must be like for Xander, living alone in the mountains with only memories of his lost family for company. They reached the ranch as the sun was setting, just as Xander had predicted. The property sat in a wide valley surrounded by pine-covered hills, with a creek running along the eastern edge. The house was small but well-built, made of logs with a stone chimney and a wide porch. There was a barn, a corral, and several smaller outbuildings scattered around the property. Sarah could see cattle grazing in the distance, dark shapes against the golden grass. "It is beautiful," Sophie breathed, and Sarah had to agree. Xander pulled the wagon up to the house and set the brake. "Welcome home," he said, and then seemed to realize what he had said. "I mean, welcome to the ranch." But Sarah had heard the slip, and something warm flickered in her chest. Home. It had been so long since anywhere had felt like home. Xander showed them inside. The interior of the house was simple but clean, with a main room that served as kitchen and living area, and two smaller rooms off to the side. One was clearly Xander's bedroom, and the other appeared to be for storage. "I will clear out the storage room for you two," Xander said. "There is a bed frame in there already. I just need to move some boxes." "We can share," Sophie said quickly. "We are used to it." "All right, give me a few minutes." While Xander worked, Sarah explored the kitchen. There was a cast iron stove, shelves lined with basic supplies, a sturdy table with 4 chairs, and a counter for food preparation. Everything was practical and functional, with no decorative touches. It was a house built for survival, not comfort, but Sarah could see the potential. With some effort, they could make this place feel like a home instead of just a shelter. Xander emerged from the storage room, his arms full of boxes. "It is ready. I will get your things from the wagon." "We do not have any things," Sarah said quietly. "Everything was sold to pay the debts." Xander paused, then nodded. "We will get you what you need. There is a general store about 10 miles from here. We can ride over in a few days." That night, they had a real meal for the first time in days. Sarah cooked while Sophie set the table, and Xander brought in fresh water from the pump outside. They ate roasted chicken and vegetables from Xander's garden, and Sarah was surprised by how good everything tasted. Or maybe she was just so relieved to be somewhere safe that everything seemed better. After dinner, Xander showed them around the ranch by lamplight. The barn housed 3 horses, including the 2 that had pulled the wagon, and there were chickens in a coop and a milk cow in a small paddock. He explained the daily chores, the schedule for feeding and watering the animals, the routine that kept the ranch running. "I know it seems like a lot," he said, seeing Sarah's expression. "But you will get used to it, and I will help. I am not expecting you to do everything yourselves." "We will manage," Sarah said, lifting her chin stubbornly. Xander smiled slightly. "I believe you will." That night, lying in the narrow bed next to Sophie, Sarah listened to the unfamiliar sounds of the ranch. The wind in the pines, the distant lowing of cattle, the creak of the house settling. It was so different from the cramped rooms they had shared with their father, so different from the dusty streets of Sloan. Different, but maybe, possibly better. "Sarah," Sophie whispered in the darkness. "Yes. Do you think we can trust him?" Sarah thought about the question, really thought about it. "I think so," she said finally. "But we will be careful anyway. All right. All right." The first few weeks at the ranch passed in a blur of work and adjustment. Sarah and Sophie fell into a routine, rising before dawn to help Xander with the morning chores, then spending the day cooking, cleaning, mending, and tending the garden. It was exhausting work, but it was honest work, and Sarah found herself taking pride in it. She liked seeing the results of her efforts, liked the feeling of being useful and needed. Sophie, too, began to come out of her shell. She took to the animals immediately, spending hours in the barn talking to the horses and collecting eggs from the chickens. She hummed while she worked, and sometimes Sarah heard her singing the old songs their mother used to sing, the ones their father had taught them. and Xander, true to his word, treated them with respect. He never entered their room without knocking, never made inappropriate comments, never touched them except to offer a hand when they climbed into the wagon or needed help lifting something heavy. He worked alongside them, often doing the hardest jobs himself, and in the evenings he would sit on the porch and whittle or read while Sarah and Sophie cleaned up from dinner. Slowly, Sarah began to relax. She caught herself smiling more often, laughing at something silly Sophie said or at one of Xander's dry observations about the cattle. She stopped jumping at sudden noises and started sleeping through the night, but she also found herself watching Xander more closely. She noticed the way his face softened when he looked at the mountains, the way his hands were always gentle with the animals, the way he sometimes stared into the fire with a faraway expression that spoke of old pain. She noticed how he always made sure she and Sophie ate before he did, how he checked that they had enough blankets when the nights grew cold, how he asked about their well-being without prying. She noticed, too, the way her heart beat a little faster when he smiled at her, the way her skin tingled when their hands accidentally brushed reaching for the same tool. It frightened her, this awareness, because she had sworn to herself that she would never depend on a man the way her mother had depended on their father. Men left, whether by choice or by death, and the women they left behind suffered. But Xander was different from her father, different from any man she had known. He was steady and reliable, and the way he looked at her sometimes made her feel like she was more than just a burden or a piece of property. He looked at her like she mattered, like her thoughts and feelings were important. It was dangerous, feeling this way. But Sarah could not seem to stop. One evening in late October, about 6 weeks after they had arrived at the ranch, Xander came in from checking the cattle with a worried expression. "Storm coming," he said, shrugging off his coat. "A big one from the looks of it. We need to get everything secured." They worked until well after dark, bringing the horses into the barn, covering the woodpile, checking that all the shutters were secure. By the time they finished, the wind had picked up, and Sarah could smell rain in the air. Sure enough, the storm hit just after midnight. Sarah woke to the sound of thunder cracking overhead and rain pounding on the roof. Sophie stirred beside her, whimpering in her sleep. "It is all right," Sarah soothed, but another crash of thunder made them both jump. There was a soft knock on their door. "Are you two all right?" Xander's voice called. Sarah wrapped a blanket around herself and opened the door. Xander stood in the doorway holding a lamp, his hair mussed from sleep. "We are fine," she said. "Just loud." "It will probably go on most of the night," Xander said. "If you cannot sleep, there is coffee on the stove." But before Sarah could answer, there was a tremendous crack of lightning and suddenly the barn was glowing. "Fire!" "Hell," Xander swore, already moving. He thrust the lamp at Sarah. "Stay here." "No," Sarah said, setting the lamp down. "I am coming with you." "Sarah, those are our animals too," she said firmly. "I am helping." There was no time to argue. Xander grabbed his coat and hat and ran for the door, Sarah right behind him. The rain was coming down in sheets, so thick she could barely see, but the orange glow from the barn was unmistakable. When they reached the barn, they found that lightning had struck the roof, and one corner was already burning despite the rain. The horses were panicking, screaming and kicking in their stalls. "Get them out!" Xander shouted over the storm. He grabbed a bucket and started throwing water on the flames while Sarah ran to open the stall doors. The horses were terrified, their eyes rolling white, but Sarah had learned their temperaments over the past weeks. She grabbed the nearest one by the halter and pulled, using her voice and her body weight to force the horse outside. Then back for the next one and the next. The smoke was thick now, choking her, and the heat from the fire was intense. On her fourth trip in, she saw that part of the roof was sagging dangerously. "Xander, get out!" she screamed. But Xander was still fighting the fire, still trying to save the structure. Sarah grabbed his arm and pulled. "It is not worth your life. Get out." For a moment, she thought he would refuse, but then another beam cracked overhead, and he let her drag him toward the door. They stumbled out into the rain just as a large section of the roof collapsed inward, sending up a shower of sparks. They stood there gasping, watching the barn burn. Sarah realized she was still gripping Xander's arm, her fingers digging into his sleeve, and she forced herself to let go. "I am sorry," she said, the words nearly lost in the storm. "I know that barn meant something to you." Xander looked at her, rain streaming down his face. "You could have been killed, so could you? That is different." "Why?" "Because you are a man and I am just a woman you bought at an auction." The words came out sharper than she intended, all her fear and adrenaline finding an outlet. "No," Xander said, and suddenly his hands were on her shoulders, holding her steady. "Because you matter. You and Sophie both. You matter more than any damn barn." Sarah stared at him, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might burst. Rain plastered her hair to her face, and she was shaking, but she could not look away from his eyes. "Xander," she whispered, and she was not sure what she was asking for, but he seemed to understand. He pulled her against him, wrapping his arms around her, and Sarah buried her face in his chest and let herself shake. She felt his chin rest on top of her head, felt the steady beat of his heart beneath her cheek, and something inside her that had been wound tight for months finally began to loosen. They stood like that for a long time, until the rain began to ease and the fire burned itself out. When they finally pulled apart, Sophie was standing on the porch watching them, wrapped in a blanket. "Is everyone all right?" she called. "We are fine," Sarah called back. "The animals are safe." The horses had scattered into the corral and the surrounding area, but they were alive and unharmed. The barn, however, was a total loss. In the gray light of dawn, Sarah could see the blackened beams and the collapsed roof, and her heart sank. "We will rebuild," Xander said, following her gaze. "It will take time, but we will do it." "We do not have the money," Sarah said practically. "That barn was worth more than we can earn in a year." "Then it will take longer than a year," Xander said. "But we will manage, we always do." "We." He kept saying we like they were a unit, a team, like the ranch belonged to all of them. Over the next few weeks, they worked to rebuild what the fire had destroyed. Xander rode into town to buy lumber and nails, and he showed Sarah and Sophie how to measure and cut, how to hammer straight. The work was slow and difficult, but there was something satisfying about it, about watching the new barn take shape board by board. During this time, Sarah found herself talking to Xander more. They would work side by side, and he would tell her stories about growing up in Texas, about the ranch his parents had tried to build before the Comanche raid. He spoke about his sister, Jenny, with a mixture of love and grief that made Sarah's chest ache. And he asked about Sarah's life, about her mother and father, about the dreams she had before everything fell apart. "I wanted to be a teacher," Sarah admitted one afternoon. They were taking a break, sitting in the shade and drinking water while Sophie fed the chickens. "I loved books, loved learning, but there was never money for school, and then my mother died and I had to take care of Sophie." "You did a good job," Xander said. "She is a sweet girl. You raised her well." "I did what I had to do. That does not make it any less admirable." Xander looked at her, and Sarah felt that now familiar flutter in her stomach. "You are strong, Sarah, stronger than you know." "I do not feel strong," she confessed. "Most days I feel like I am barely holding everything together." "That is what strength is," Xander said. holding on when everything in you wants to let go. Their eyes met, and Sarah felt the air between them charge with something unspoken. She wanted to reach out to touch his face to close the small distance between them, but fear held her back. What if she was misreading everything? What if he only saw her as an obligation, a responsibility he had taken on out of guilt for his lost sister? Before she could decide what to do, Sophie came running over. "Sarah, look. The chickens laid 6 eggs today. That is more than ever." The moment passed, but Sarah carried the warmth of it with her for the rest of the day. As autumn deepened into winter, the valley transformed. Snow began to fall, dusting the mountains and occasionally covering the ranch in a blanket of white. Xander taught Sarah and Sophie how to prepare for the harsh weather, how to store food and chop extra wood, how to keep the animals warm and fed when the temperature dropped below freezing. The work brought them even closer together. They spent long evenings inside, huddled around the fireplace while the wind howled outside. Xander would read aloud from the few books he owned, his deep voice bringing the words to life. Sophie would sew or knit, her clever fingers creating mittens and scarves for all of them. And Sarah would sit and listen, watching the firelight play across Xander's face, feeling more content than she had in years. One night in December, after Sophie had gone to bed, Sarah found herself alone with Xander by the fire. He was oiling a saddle, his hands moving with practiced skill, and she was mending one of his shirts. "Can I ask you something?" Sarah said, breaking the comfortable silence. "Of course." "Why did you never marry? You are a good man, and this ranch could support a family. Why live alone out here?" Xander's hands stilled. "I did not think it would be fair to ask a woman to share this life. It is hard and isolated, and after Jenny disappeared, I did not want to get close to anyone. It hurt too much to lose her." "But you are not alone anymore," Sarah pointed out gently. "We are here." "You are," Xander agreed, looking up at her. "And I am grateful for that. This house has felt more like a home in the past few months than it has in years." Sarah set down her mending. "Xander, I need to know something. Do you still see us as just hired help, or are we more than that?" It was a bold question. Too bold maybe, but Sarah was tired of dancing around her feelings. She needed to know if what she felt was mutual, or if she was just projecting her own loneliness onto a man who had shown her basic kindness. Xander set down the saddle and stood, moving to sit beside her on the bench. He was close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from him, could smell the leather and smoke and clean male scent that was uniquely his. "You were never just hired help," he said quietly. "From the moment I saw you on that platform, looking so fierce and protective of your sister, I knew you were special. And these past months, getting to know you, working alongside you, I have realized that I do not want you to leave. Not ever. If that makes you uncomfortable, tell me and I will never mention it again. But you asked for honesty, and that is the truth." Sarah's heart was racing. "It does not make me uncomfortable," she whispered. "It makes me happy, because I feel the same way." Xander reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wanted, and cupped her face in his hand. His palm was rough and warm, and Sarah leaned into the touch. "I am not good with words," Xander said, "but I want you to know that you are not an obligation to me. You are not a burden or a responsibility. You are a woman I admire and respect, and if you would let me, I would like to court you properly." "Court me," Sarah repeated, a smile tugging at her lips. "We live in the same house. We eat every meal together. Is that not already beyond courting?" Xander smiled too, a full, genuine smile that transformed his usually serious face. "Then maybe I am doing this backwards, but I do not care about the order as long as you are willing." "I am willing," Sarah said, and then, gathering her courage, she leaned forward and kissed him. It was a soft kiss, tentative and sweet, but it sent warmth flooding through Sarah's entire body. Xander's arms came around her, pulling her closer, and she let herself melt into him, into this moment that felt like coming home. When they finally pulled apart, both of them were breathing hard. Sarah rested her forehead against Xander's, her hands gripping the front of his shirt. "I was so afraid," she admitted. "Afraid to feel this way, afraid you did not feel the same, afraid of losing someone else I cared about." "I am afraid too," Xander confessed. "But I am more afraid of letting you go. I have been alone for so long, Sarah. I do not want to be alone anymore." "You are not alone," Sarah said firmly. "You have me, and you have Sophie. We are a family now if you want us to be." "I want that more than anything," Xander said, and he kissed her again, longer this time, deeper, until Sarah forgot about her fears and doubts and surrendered to the joy of being wanted and cherished. They sat together by the fire until the logs burned down to embers, talking about everything and nothing, making plans for the future. Xander told her about his dreams for the ranch, about wanting to expand the herd and build a bigger house. Sarah told him about her dream of having a library, a whole room full of books that she could read whenever she wanted. They laughed about silly things and were serious about important ones, and by the time they finally said goodnight, Sarah felt like she was walking on air. The next morning, Sophie took one look at Sarah's face and grinned. "Something happened," she said knowingly. Sarah blushed. "Xander and I talked last night." "Just talked," Sophie teased. "Mostly talked," Sarah admitted, unable to stop smiling. Sophie threw her arms around her sister. "I am so happy for you. He is a good man, Sarah. You deserve someone who treats you well." "What about you?" Sarah asked, suddenly worried. "Are you all right with this? I do not want you to feel left out." "Are you joking? I have been waiting for you two to realize you were in love for weeks now." "It was so obvious." Sophie pulled back, her expression becoming more serious. "You have spent your whole life taking care of me. It is time you let yourself be happy. And Xander makes you happy, I can see it." "He does," Sarah agreed softly. "He really does." From that day forward, things changed between Sarah and Xander. They were still careful to be respectful, especially around Sophie, but there was a new openness, a new warmth. Xander would reach for Sarah's hand when they walked to the barn, would drop a kiss on her forehead when he passed her in the kitchen. Sarah would lean against him while they sat by the fire, would laugh more freely, and tease him gently. Sophie watched it all with obvious delight, and she told Sarah more than once how glad she was to see her sister so happy. Christmas came, and they celebrated quietly. Sarah and Sophie used scraps of fabric to make small decorations for the house, and Xander surprised them by bringing home a small tree from the mountain. They decorated it with strings of popcorn and berries, and on Christmas morning, Xander gave them each a present. For Sophie, it was a beautiful set of watercolors that he had ordered from a catalog. For Sarah, it was a book, a leather-bound volume of poetry that must have cost him dearly. "I know you love to read," Xander said as Sarah traced the embossed cover with trembling fingers. "I thought you might enjoy this." "It is perfect," Sarah whispered, blinking back tears. "Thank you." She had nothing to give him in return except a scarf she had knitted from yarn she had unraveled from one of her old sweaters. It was plain and simple, but Xander wrapped it around his neck and declared it the finest scarf he had ever owned. That night, after Sophie had gone to bed, Sarah and Xander stood on the porch looking at the stars. The air was cold and crisp, and their breath formed clouds in the darkness. "This has been the best Christmas I have had in years," Xander said, his arm around Sarah's waist. "Me too," Sarah agreed. She hesitated, then said, "I love you, Xander. I know it is soon, but I need you to know." Xander turned her to face him, his eyes intense in the moonlight. It is not too soon. I love you too, Sarah. I think I have since the moment I saw you refusing to be broken by what was happening to you. You are the strongest, most beautiful woman I have ever known, and I thank God every day that I found you." They kissed under the stars, and Sarah felt like her heart might burst with happiness. Winter slowly gave way to spring. The snow melted, the creek swelled with runoff, and the valley came alive with wildflowers and new grass. The cattle thrived, and Xander was able to sell some of them at a good price, bringing in much-needed income. He used part of the money to finish the barn and to buy Sarah and Sophie new dresses, the first new clothes they had owned in years. In April, on a sunny afternoon when the world seemed full of promise, Xander asked Sarah to marry him. They were sitting by the creek, watching the water flow over the rocks, and he took her hand. "I know we have not been courting long by traditional standards," he said. "But I know my own heart, and I know I want to spend the rest of my life with you. Will you marry me, Sarah?" Sarah felt tears prick her eyes, but they were happy tears. "Yes," she said, her voice shaking. "Yes, I will marry you." Xander pulled out a simple gold ring, a family heirloom that had belonged to his grandmother. "It is not fancy," he said apologetically, "but it is all I have." "It is perfect," Sarah said, and she meant it. She did not need fancy, she just needed him. They were married in June, in a simple ceremony at the small church in Sloan. Sophie stood beside Sarah as her witness, and the ranch hand Xander had hired for the spring roundup stood beside him. The preacher was the same man who had looked on impassively during the auction 9 months earlier, but if he recognized Sarah and Sophie, he said nothing. Sarah wore the new dress Xander had bought her, pale blue with white lace at the collar, and she carried a bouquet of wildflowers Sophie had picked that morning. Xander wore his best suit, his dark hair neatly combed, and when he looked at Sarah, the love in his eyes took her breath away. "I, Xander Orville, take you, Sarah Fairchild, to be my lawfully wedded wife," he said, his voice steady and sure. "To have and to hold from this day forward, for better or for worse, for richer or for poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, till death do us part." Sarah repeated the vows, her voice choked with emotion. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Xander kissed her deeply, and the small congregation of townspeople applauded. Afterward, they had a simple meal at the town's only restaurant, and then they made the long journey back to the ranch. Sophie chattered the whole way, excitedly planning where they would plant the new garden and what they would name the calf that had been born last week. Sarah and Xander held hands in the front of the wagon, not needing words to communicate their happiness. That night, after Sophie had gone to bed in what was now officially her room alone, Sarah joined Xander in what had become their bedroom. She was nervous, her hands shaking as she unpinned her hair, but Xander was gentle and patient. He made love to her slowly, reverently, whispering words of love and devotion, and Sarah felt tears stream down her face at the overwhelming rightness of it all. "Are you all right?" Xander asked, concerned, wiping away her tears. "I am more than all right," Sarah said, laughing and crying at the same time. "I am happy, so incredibly happy." "Good," Xander said, kissing her forehead. "That is all I ever want for you." The summer passed in a blur of work and joy. Sarah threw herself into making the ranch house a true home, sewing curtains for the windows and planting flowers around the porch. Sophie helped with the gardening and took over most of the care for the chickens and the milk cow. And Xander worked from sunup to sundown, building fences and tending the cattle, always with a smile for his wife and sister-in-law when he came in for meals. They fell into an easy rhythm, the three of them, each contributing to the household in their own way. Sophie's laughter rang through the house, and sometimes she would play the harmonica Xander had given her, filling the evenings with music. Sarah sang while she cooked, old songs and new ones, and Xander would sometimes join in with his deep bass voice. In August, Sarah realized she was pregnant. She waited to be sure before telling Xander, and when she finally did, sitting on the edge of their bed one night, his reaction was everything she could have hoped for. He let out a whoop of joy and picked her up, spinning her around until she was dizzy and laughing. "We are going to have a baby," he kept saying, his voice full of wonder. "A baby, Sarah." "We are," she confirmed, her hands on his face. "Are you happy?" "Happy? I am the luckiest man alive." He set her down carefully, suddenly worried. "Are you feeling all right? Do you need anything?" "Should you be resting?" Sarah laughed at his concern. "I am fine. Women have babies all the time, but yes, I will need to be more careful as I get bigger." "We will get a doctor," Xander said immediately. "I will not take any chances with you or the baby." "There is no doctor for Miles," Sarah reminded him. "But Sophie and I have helped with births before. We will manage." But Xander was insistent, and the next week he rode into town and arranged for the doctor to come visit Sarah regularly throughout her pregnancy. The cost was high, but Xander did not care. He would do anything to keep Sarah safe. As Sarah's belly grew, Xander became even more protective. He insisted she stop doing the heavy work, and he and Sophie took over most of the chores. Sarah protested at first, but eventually she gave in, recognizing that he needed to feel like he was taking care of her. Sophie was thrilled at the prospect of becoming an aunt. She spent hours sewing baby clothes and knitting tiny blankets, her needle flying as she worked. She talked excitedly about teaching the baby to ride horses and to sing, and Sarah was touched by her sister's enthusiasm. "You are going to be a wonderful mother," Sophie told Sarah one afternoon. They were sitting on the porch shelling peas, enjoying the late summer sunshine. "I hope so," Sarah said. "I am terrified, to be honest. What if something goes wrong? What if I am not good enough? You raised me," Sophie pointed out. "And I turned out all right, did I not?" "You turned out better than all right," Sarah said, reaching over to squeeze her sister's hand. "You are the best person I know." "That is because I had the best teacher," Sophie said. Then, more seriously, "Sarah, I have been thinking. Maybe it is time I found my own place, got out of your way." "What? No," Sarah said, alarmed. "Sophie, you are not in the way. This is your home." "I know, but you and Xander are starting a family now. You need space." "We have plenty of space," Sarah said firmly. "And Xander loves having you here. He told me once that he thinks of you as the sister he lost. Please do not leave, not unless you really want to." Sophie's eyes filled with tears. "I do not want to leave, I just do not want to be a burden." "You are not a burden," Sarah said, pulling her sister into a hug. "You are family. Always." In March of 1883, on a cold but clear morning, Sarah went into labor. Xander, who had been checking on the cattle, came running when Sophie called for him, his face pale with worry. The doctor had been staying at the ranch for the past week, anticipating the birth, and he took charge immediately. The labor was long and difficult. Sarah gritted her teeth through the pain, refusing to cry out, but Xander held her hand the entire time, murmuring words of encouragement. Sophie stood by with water and towels, doing whatever the doctor asked. Finally, as the sun was setting, the baby was born. A healthy boy with a full head of dark hair and lungs that worked perfectly, judging by his lusty cries. "You did it," Xander said, tears streaming down his face as he held Sarah close. "He is perfect. You are perfect." Sarah was exhausted but exhilarated, cradling her son against her chest. "What should we name him?" she asked. Xander looked down at the baby, his expression soft. "What about James?" "After my father, James Orville," Sarah said, testing the name. "I like it." Sophie peeked over Xander's shoulder at her nephew, her face glowing. "He is beautiful. Can I hold him?" "Of course," Sarah said, carefully transferring the baby to Sophie's arms. "Meet your Aunt Sophie, James. She is going to spoil you rotten." "That is my job as an aunt," Sophie said, gently rocking the baby, "and I take it very seriously." The next few months were exhausting but wonderful. James was a good baby, sleeping for long stretches and eating well, and Sarah recovered quickly from the birth. Xander was a devoted father, getting up in the night to walk with James when he cried, changing diapers without complaint, and spending hours just staring at his son with a look of awe on his face. "I cannot believe he is ours," he would say to Sarah. "I cannot believe how lucky we are." "We are lucky," Sarah agreed. "All of us." Sophie doted on her nephew, singing to him and making him smile with funny faces. She was a natural with children, and Sarah often thought about how Sophie would make a wonderful mother herself someday. As if reading her mind, Xander brought up the subject one evening. "Sophie is nearly 21 now," he said quietly. They were sitting on the porch watching the sunset, James asleep in Sarah's arms. "Have you thought about finding her a husband?" "Sophie is not a horse to be traded," Sarah said sharply, then softened. "But yes, I have thought about it. She deserves to be happy to have a family of her own, but I do not want to push her. She will find someone when she is ready." "There is a new school teacher in town," Xander said casually. "I met him last week when I went for supplies. Young fellow, maybe 25, seemed nice. I invited him out to the ranch for dinner next month." Sarah looked at him suspiciously. "You are matchmaking." "I am providing opportunities," Xander corrected with a grin. "There is a difference." As it turned out, the schoolteacher, a man named Thomas Gray, and Sophie hit it off immediately. He came to dinner and stayed talking until well past midnight, his and Sophie's conversation ranging from books to music to their dreams for the future. By the time he left, Sophie was blushing and smiling, and Sarah knew her sister was smitten. Thomas became a regular visitor to the ranch, and by summer he had asked Sophie to marry him. She said yes, her face glowing with happiness, and Sarah cried as she hugged her sister. "I am so happy for you," Sarah said. "He is a good man." "He is," Sophie agreed. "And he wants to stay in the area, so I will still be close by. I will still be able to see you and James all the time." "Good," Sarah said fiercely, "because I need my sister." Sophie and Thomas were married in September, exactly 2 years after Sarah and Sophie had been sold at auction in Sloan. The wedding was small but joyful, held at the ranch under a brilliant blue sky. James, now 6 months old, was the ring bearer, carried down the aisle by a grinning Xander while Sarah looked on with tears in her eyes. After the ceremony, as they all sat down to the wedding feast Sarah had prepared, she looked around at the faces of the people she loved. Sophie and Thomas, gazing at each other with undisguised adoration. Xander, holding James and looking at Sarah with so much love it took her breath away, and she thought about how far they had come from that terrible day on the auction block. That night, after the guests had left and Sophie and Thomas had departed for their new home near the schoolhouse, Sarah and Xander stood on the porch with James between them. "It has been quite a journey," Xander said softly. "It has," Sarah agreed. "Sometimes I still cannot believe this is my life, that I am this happy." "You deserve to be happy," Xander said, wrapping his arm around her shoulders. "You and Sophie both. You have been through so much." "We all have," Sarah said. "But we found each other. That is what matters." "Do you ever think about that day?" Xander asked. "The auction?" "Sometimes," Sarah admitted. "But not with the same pain I used to feel. Now when I think about it, I think about how you stepped in, how you saved us. It was the worst day of my life, but it was also the day my real life began." Xander kissed the top of her head. "I am glad I was there. I am glad I could help, and I am selfishly glad that it brought you into my life." "There is nothing selfish about love," Sarah said, turning to look up at him. "Love is the most generous thing there is." They stood together in the gathering darkness, their son sleeping peacefully in Sarah's arms, and watched the first stars appear in the sky. The ranch spread out around them, the land they had built together, the home they had created from nothing but determination and hope. The years that followed were good ones. The ranch prospered under Xander's careful management, and they were able to expand their holdings and hire permanent hands to help with the work. Sarah gave birth to 2 more children, a daughter they named Jenny after Xander's lost sister, and another son they called William. The house was always full of noise and laughter, with children running through the rooms and Sophie's family visiting regularly. Sophie and Thomas had 3 children of their own, and the cousins grew up together, spending long summer days at the ranch and creating memories that would last a lifetime. Sophie never stopped being grateful for the life she had, and she told Sarah more than once that she could not imagine what would have become of them if Xander had not bought them both that day. "We would have survived," Sarah always said. "We always do." "But we would not have thrived," Sophie would respond, "and there is a difference." As Sarah grew older, she never forgot where she had come from. She became an advocate for women's rights in their small community, speaking out against the practice of selling people to settle debts and working to change the laws that allowed such things to happen. It was an uphill battle, but Sarah was nothing if not persistent, and slowly, attitudes began to change. Xander supported her efforts completely, often accompanying her to town meetings and standing beside her when she spoke. He was proud of his wife's strength and determination, and he told her often that she was the bravest person he knew. "I am not brave," Sarah would say. "I am just doing what needs to be done." "That is what bravery is," Xander would respond, echoing the words he had said to her so many years ago. On their 20th wedding anniversary, Xander surprised Sarah with a gift. He had built a small addition to the house, a room lined with shelves, and he had filled those shelves with books. "Your library," he said, leading her inside. "I know it is not as grand as you dreamed of, but it is a start." Sarah stood in the center of the room, tears streaming down her face, and turned slowly to take it all in. There were hundreds of books, everything from novels to poetry to history, and she recognized some of the titles from wishes she had expressed over the years. "How did you afford all this?" she whispered. "I have been saving," Xander said, "a little here and there for years. I wanted to give you something that was just for you, something that showed you how much you mean to me." Sarah threw her arms around him, holding him tight. "You have already given me everything that matters, but this is wonderful, thank you." They stood together in the library, surrounded by books and memories, and Sarah thought about the girl she had been at 21, standing on an auction block with her world falling apart. If someone had told her then that in 20 years she would be happy, that she would be loved and cherished and building a legacy with a man who treated her as an equal, she would not have believed it. But here she was, and she was grateful for every moment. As Sarah entered her 40s and then her 50s, she watched her children grow and marry and start families of their own. James took over much of the ranch work from Xander, who was slowing down with age but still insisted on doing his share. Jenny became a teacher like her Aunt Sophie, and William went east to study law, determined to fight for justice in the courts. Sophie remained Sarah's closest friend and confidante, and they saw each other almost every week. They would sit together on Sarah's porch, watching the grandchildren play and marvel at how their lives had turned out. "You ever wonder what happened to those other girls?" Sophie asked one day. They were both in their 60s now, their hair gray and their hands marked by years of work. The ones who were sold that day in Sloan. Sometimes, Sarah admitted. I hope they found happiness too. I hope they found someone who treated them kindly. We were lucky, Sophie said softly. So incredibly lucky. We were, Sarah agreed, but she also knew that luck had only been part of it. They had survived through strength and love and sheer stubborn determination not to be broken. And Xander had given them the chance to do more than just survive. He had given them the chance to thrive. Xander passed away peacefully in his sleep at the age of 78 with Sarah holding his hand. His last words were, I love you. I have loved you from the beginning, and I will love you beyond the end. Sarah mourned him deeply, but she did not regret a single moment of their life together. They had built something beautiful, something that would last long after they were both gone. The ranch continued under James's management, and the Orville name became synonymous with fairness and integrity in the region. Sarah lived another 10 years after Xander's death, surrounded by her children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren. She never stopped reading, never stopped learning, never stopped fighting for what was right. And when she finally passed away in her sleep at the age of 89, she went with a smile on her face, knowing that she had lived a full and meaningful life. At her funeral, her granddaughter read from Sarah's favorite poem, the one Xander had given her in that leather-bound book so many years ago. And as the words floated over the gathered family, James stood and told the story of how his parents had met, how his father had bought his mother and aunt at an auction and driven them home together, how love had grown from the darkest of circumstances. My father used to say that the best things in life come when you do what is right, not what is easy, James said, his voice thick with emotion. He saved my mother and my aunt because it was the right thing to do, and in doing so, he saved himself. He found love and family and purpose. And he taught all of us that no matter how dark things seem, there is always hope. There is always the possibility of something better. The family gathered at the ranch after the funeral, spilling out onto the porch and the yard, children running through the same spaces Sarah and Sophie had worked in so many years ago. And as the sun set over the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, they raised their glasses in a toast. To Sarah and Xander, James said, to love that endures, to family that supports, to the courage to do what is right even when it is hard. May we all be worthy of their legacy. To Sarah and Xander, the family echoed, and as the last light faded from the sky, the ranch settled into peaceful darkness, a testament to the power of love and the strength of the human spirit. The ranch still stands today, passed down through generations of Orvilles. Each one taught the story of their ancestors, and the lessons of courage, compassion, and love that Sarah and Xander embodied. And sometimes, on quiet evenings when the wind whispers through the pines, people say you can feel their presence, two souls forever bound by a love that transcended the worst circumstances to create something beautiful and lasting. It was never just a story about two sisters who were sold to different men and a cowboy who bought them both and drove them home together. It was a story about choosing hope over despair, about building a future from the broken pieces of the past, and about the transformative power of love that sees people not as property, but as precious souls deserving of dignity and happiness. And in the end, that is what Sarah and Xander created together, a legacy of love that would echo through the generations, proof that even in the darkest moments light can break through, and that the human heart, when given the chance, is capable of extraordinary things.